On a summer morning in 2007, a woman was working in the printing shop she owned in a suburban strip mall. Suddenly, she heard a loud banging sound coming from somewhere above her. She stopped the printer she was working on so she could hear better, and the sound kept coming. Bang, 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 bang. It was like metal drawers opening and slamming shut over and over again. She was about to go outside to see what was going on, but then she stopped and just started laughing. Her friend, who owned the business right above her on the second floor, had a habit of rearranging his office, so the banging she was hearing was very likely the sound of the file cabinets just getting moved around. And so, as a joke, she shouted up through the ceiling, "Hey, keep it down up there. I'm working." And then she restarted the printer. But about an hour and a half later, she heard another loud sound. This time, it was the wail of sirens as police cars raced into the parking lot. The woman would soon find out that the noises she had heard earlier were not her upstairs neighbor rearranging furniture. Instead, it was the sound of one of the most violent crimes to hit this safe, quiet suburb in years. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please secretly lower the follow button's Wi-Fi signal strength so everything loads painfully slow. Okay, let's get into today's story. On June 7, 2007, 48-year-old Bob-eyed man sat at his desk across from a client at the small auto insurance company he owned in St. Charles, Missouri, a suburb of St. Louis. Bob and his client talked like they were old friends. That was how Bob was with all of his clients. Part of the reason for this was that Bob just loved talking to people, but he also knew that a lot of his clients came to him when they had no other option, and they were often stressed out about making car insurance payments, so he tried hard to put them at ease. Bob went out of his way to work with people who had bad credit or a history of traffic violations, or maybe who had gotten a DUI. These were people who desperately needed auto insurance because without it, they couldn't drive, but they simply couldn't get insured by larger companies. Bob was well aware of this and made sure he never, ever took advantage of these people's desperation. Instead, he offered affordable rates, accepted cash payments, and worked with clients to come up with insurance plans that they could actually handle. And so, because of this, Bob had gotten a reputation in town as being as much a benefactor as he was a businessman. In the office, Bob's client handed him an envelope of cash to cover her payment for the month. They talked a bit longer, and then the client left. Once the door was closed, Bob marked the payment in his books, opened a desk drawer where he kept his cash hidden, and tucked the money inside. After that, he looked down at his phone and realized it was later than he thought, so he quickly grabbed a stack of business cards off his desk, slipped them in his pocket, and walked out. Bob's office was on the second floor of a strip mall, so once he was outside, he walked right down the steps to the parking lot, got in his car, and pulled out onto the street. Even though St. Charles was only about 30 minutes from the major city of St. Louis, it felt like a small town. This was a place where a lot of residents kept their doors unlocked and even left their keys in their cars. As Bob drove, he saw loads of people outside enjoying the beautiful spring weather and walking along the Missouri River that wound its way through St. Charles. Bob was a member of the St. Charles Chamber of Commerce, so he loved seeing people taking advantage of the natural beauty the town had to offer, And as an active member of the community, he really believed this was the kind of place where someone could help others and still succeed in business. A few minutes later, Bob pulled into the parking lot of a car dealership in town, and when he did, he got a huge smile on his face because he saw his wife, Diane, standing outside the showroom waiting for him. So Bob parked his car, hopped outside, and walked right over to his wife and gave her a kiss on the cheek. The two had been married for 28 years. But they'd only started working together about a year ago when Bob opened up his insurance business. People who knew them thought they complemented each other perfectly. Bob was this big guy with messy gray hair who loved to talk, while Diane looked undated like a total professional. And even though they went about things differently, they shared a drive and an appreciation for hard work. In fact, Diane had a full-time job at a hospital, but she still managed to carve out a few hours almost every day to help her husband in his office or to do some marketing for the insurance company, which is actually why they were there at the car dealership. Bob handed Diane half of the business cards he brought, and then the two of them split up and began talking to everyone at the dealership who might be looking for a new car. This was one of the ways they marketed Bob's company and found new clients. The two of them spent the rest of the day handing out cards and talking to people. By the time they were finished, they were worn out, but they felt like they'd put in a good, honest day of work. That night, back at home, Bob stayed up and brainstormed more possible marketing ideas while Diane went to bed early. She had to be up and out of the house by 5:00 a.m. the next day to make her shift at the hospital. Bob knew how hard it had been for Diane working basically nonstop across multiple jobs, but he told himself this would all be worth it. The risk he had taken by opening up his own business would eventually pay off. He knew it. Then he'd be able to give Diane a happier, easier life. At 10:00 on the following day, June 8th, Bob walked into his office, went to his desk, and got right to work going over his financial statements and planning client meetings. And he'd been working for about an hour when he heard the office door open, so he stopped what he was doing and he looked up from his desk. At 12:30 p.m., so 2.5 hours after Bob had gotten to the office, a postal worker was making her daily rounds through the same strip mall. She delivered mail to all the businesses on the first floor and then headed upstairs to drop a package off for Bob. She opened Bob's door, said hello as she walked in, and then stopped cold right inside the doorway. She began to scream, dropped the package on the ground, and ran back down the stairs yelling for help. People began coming out of their shops and offices to see what was going on. At the same time, this postal worker just happened to spot a police cruiser coming down the street towards the strip mall, so she sprinted across the parking lot and ran out into the road, shouting and waving her arms to get their attention. The police cruiser came to a screeching halt, and an officer got out and asked her what was wrong. And the postal worker, who could barely breathe, began to describe what she had just seen. A moment later, that same police officer was entering Bob's office, and just like the postal worker had done, the officer froze in the office doorway. He had been on the force for years, but what he saw in the office still hit him hard. Because on the floor right in front of him, Bob lay motionless, surrounded by a pool of blood. The officer quickly pulled himself together, ran across the office, and crouched down over Bob's body. He checked for a pulse, but it was clear Bob was dead. Not long after, the officer contacted the station to report the death. Detective Donald Steff of the St. Charles Police and his superior, Captain Pat McCarrick, arrived at the scene. These were two of the most experienced investigators on the force, but even they had not had to deal with many homicides in St. Charles because at the time, the city had a far lower murder rate than the state of Missouri and the country as a whole. Detective Steff and Captain McCarrick did a walkthrough of the office and then they examined Bob's body. They saw multiple bullet wounds, but one of the shots looked like it had just grazed Bob. Steff and McCarrick also found spent shell casings and also live rounds from a 9mm handgun spread out at different spots across the floor. Because of these live rounds on the floor, which are just unshot bullets, so intact, full live rounds, the investigators thought the killer's weapon might have jammed at some point. And so maybe in an attempt to clear the jam, they had ejected these live rounds onto the ground. Or perhaps the killer might have just been an inexperienced shooter and sort of unintentionally ejected these live rounds without shooting them. The investigators dug through Bob's desk and they noticed there was no sign of a wallet or any form of it. They checked Bob's pockets and didn't find a wallet there either, so they thought maybe this had been a robbery. But not long after that, they discovered the money in Bob's cash drawer. They didn't know why a robber would have taken Bob's wallet and left all this cash behind. But maybe there was a chance that the killer was not only an inexperienced shooter, but also an inexperienced thief. Soon the investigators were joined by members of a county forensic team. Forensics officers examined and collected the shell casings as well as the live rounds. They dusted for prints and did a thorough search of Bob's body and clothes for possible DNA samples. While the forensics team worked in the office, Steph and McCarrick made their way outside and began questioning owners and employees from the other businesses in the strip mall. The woman who owned the printing shop right below Bob's office proved to be the most helpful. She told investigators she had seen Bob pull into the parking lot around 10:00 a.m. and at about 11:00, she said she'd heard loud banging coming from upstairs in Bob's office. She said that she figured Bob was just moving file cabinets around or something, and as a joke, she'd even yelled up to him from her office, "Hey Bob, keep the noise down." But now that she knew what had really happened to Bob, she wished at the time she heard those noises she had gone upstairs to check on him. The investigators asked her if she could think of anyone who might have had an issue with Bob, but the woman said no. Bob was one of the most likable people she knew, and she figured everyone the police would talk to would say the same thing, because that's just who Bob was. A few minutes later, as the investigators walked out of the print shop, Detective Steph scanned the strip mall, and the front door of a Mexican restaurant caught his attention. Positioned right above the restaurant door was a security camera that pointed out towards the parking lot in the street. So, the investigators went inside the restaurant and asked the owner if they could have his surveillance footage from that morning and also the night before. The owner said of course, and handed over the footage. By the time the investigators had spoken to everyone in the strip mall, it was about 3:00 p.m. Around that time, Steph and McCarrick headed towards the stairs to rejoin the forensics team inside of Bob's office. But as they were walking, they heard an officer shouting their names from the parking lot. They turned around and saw the officer standing there with a woman, and as they made eye contact with this officer, he quickly came over to them. He said the woman he was with was Bob's wife, Diane. She'd been trying to get a hold of Bob, but he never answered, so she came up here to see if everything was okay. He said Diane obviously knew something was going on here because of the police presence, but she didn't actually know what had happened to Bob. Detective Steph took a breath, and then he and his captain went to go speak with Diane. They introduced themselves, and then Steph broke the news that her husband had been found dead in his office and that someone had shot him. Then Steph and McCarrick offered their condolences, but Diane's response took them completely by surprise. Diane barely reacted at all, and she didn't even say anything. Now, the investigators knew that people handled news like this in very different ways, but neither of them had ever seen something like this. It was like Diane was completely devoid of emotion. Steph and McCarrick shared a quick look, and it was clear they both thought this was strange, but they were experienced enough not to jump to conclusions based on a single reaction or non-reaction from somebody who just heard such terrible news. Steph broke the silence and told Diane they'd like to ask her some questions so they could try to figure out, where to start this investigation. Diane finally spoke and said she would help if she could help if she could help if she could. Steph called over to the officer who had brought them Diane and asked him to go get them a chair. The officer ducked into one of the offices and quickly came back out again with a metal folding chair and placed it down next to Diane. Diane took a seat right there in the parking lot, and then Steph and McCarrick began questioning her. As the victim's spouse, Diane was automatically a person of interest, so the investigators started with basic questions about her and Bob's marriage. How was their marriage going lately? Did they fight? Did they have financial problems? But Diane said she and Bob had a great relationship. They fought like any married couple would, but it was nothing serious. She said financially they were fine, and with Bob's growing business, they actually hoped to be in even better shape financially soon. Without missing a beat, Captain McCarrick asked if Bob had a life insurance policy, and if so, was Diane the beneficiary? This was a pretty standard question in this situation when dealing with a victim's spouse or children, because somebody killing a family member to collect the life insurance policy was definitely not unheard of. Diane said yes, Bob had life insurance and she was the beneficiary, but it was a small policy. The payout was maybe $5,000. Now, immediately, neither of the investigators thought that was enough money for somebody to want to kill over, but they didn't want to rule anything out yet. At some point, Detective Steph asked Diane if she knew of anyone who might want to hurt Bob, and he sort of expected her answer to be similar to the one the print shop owner had given. But Diane's answer was very different. She said she did know somebody. There was a man who might have it out for Bob. She said his name was Kevin Green, and he was a rival auto insurance salesman in town. Bob had recently accused Kevin of stealing one of his clients and had actually gone to Kevin's office to confront him about it. After jotting down Kevin's name, Steph asked Diane one more question. Did Bob usually carry cash on him? Diane nodded. She said he always had a good amount of cash in his wallet, and he always carried his wallet in his back pocket, even when he was sitting at his desk. After speaking to Diane, Steph and McCarrick returned to Bob's office where forensics officers were still working. Bob's missing wallet meant that his murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad, like they thought. And so they shared the information about Bob always carrying his wallet in his back pocket with the forensics team. After hearing this, one of the forensic officers walked over to Bob's body, crouched down, and studied the back pocket of his pants. She said she would cut away the pocket from the pants and keep it as a potential source for a DNA sample. Upon hearing this, Steph and McCarrick looked confused. DNA samples could only be taken from bodily fluids, and unless they were missing something, it did not look like the pocket had any fluids on it. The forensics officer saw their looks and told them that this was sort of a long shot, but DNA testing technology was making huge advances very quickly. So maybe down the line, they might be able to pull something useful from that back pocket, despite there not being any obvious fluids on it. Now, Steph and McCarrick would love it if that wound up being the case, but there was obviously no way they could count on that. So in the meantime, they decided to start with the one person Bob might have had a beef with, Kevin Green, the rival insurance salesman. Several hours after Bob's body had been discovered, Detective Steph and Captain McCarrick walked into another small auto insurance office in St. Charles, and there they found Kevin Green working at his desk. Kevin smiled warmly and then asked how he could help, almost like he might try to sell them something. But when they told him that Bob-eyed Man had been murdered, Kevin's smile quickly disappeared and he looked genuinely shocked. The investigators laid out their reason for being there. They knew that Kevin and Bob were rivals and that Bob had recently confronted him about stealing clients, but Kevin just shook his head and said it was not like that at all. He and Bob did not have a confrontation. They just spoke, and there was no rivalry, at least not how the detectives were making it sound. He said that he and Bob were competitors, but they were cordial with each other and actually seemed to get along just fine. Steph asked Kevin if he could give them a timeline of how he'd spend his day. Kevin nodded and said he'd just gone shopping that morning at a sporting goods store, and then after that, he had come into work. After taking down some notes, Steph nodded and said they would be in touch if they needed anything else. Then the two investigators left. In the days immediately following the murder, Detective Steph and Captain McCarrick got members of their team to begin to follow up on Kevin's alibi. As for the two of them, they began to focus on the theory that Bob's murder could be the result of a robbery gone bad. If that was the case, they knew they could be looking for anyone off the streets. But they hoped that the surveillance camera footage they had gotten from the Mexican restaurant would help make the search a whole lot easier. So, Steph McCarrick and another member of their team began the painstaking process of sitting in a cramped office and watching the grainy video footage frame by frame by frame. And after only doing this for a short time, everything on the screen began to look like a blur of black and white, and it was hard to even make things out clearly. But suddenly, as Steph was staring at the monitor, he thought he saw something, and it was like he had just suddenly woken up. He told the officer they were working with to rewind the footage several minutes back. The officer did, and then all three of them leaned into the screen and watched. And this time, McCarrick and the other officer saw what Steph had seen. The same car, a Ford Focus, drove slowly through the strip mall parking lot twice within the span of a few minutes on the day of the murder. It sort of looked like the driver was staking out the place. And the final time the car drove through the lot before disappearing from the footage was about 11:00 a.m., and that was right around the time the owner of the print shop had heard all that noise coming from Bob's office right above her, and just about 90 minutes before Bob's body had been discovered. Unfortunately, the car's license plates weren't visible on the footage, and so Steph and McCarrick knew that that would make their jobs a whole lot harder. Still, they had a brand new lead here, and that was exciting. So, they had members of their team compile a list of every registered Ford Focus in the county and told them to start tracking down each of the owners. They also set up roadblocks in St. Charles in the hope that the Ford Focus in question might end up at 1. Stephen McCarrick knew that finding this car from the footage could take a long time. After all, there were a lot of Ford Focuses to check, and there was no guarantee the one they wanted was registered in this county. So, while the search for the Ford Focus got underway, the two investigators turned their attention back to the one suspect neither of them could get out of their minds: Bob's wife, Diane. During the week following the murder, Detective Steph and Captain McCarrick began digging deeper into Bob's relationship with his wife. They knew that Diane's strange and sort of cold reaction to the news of her husband's death did not necessarily mean she was guilty, but they just couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about her. So, they reached out to Bob's cell phone carrier to secure his phone records, and they also started looking into Bob and Diane's finances. And it didn't take them long to discover that Diane had lied to them. Stephen McCarrick learned that the couple was not doing well financially, like Diane had suggested. Starting and operating the insurance company had put Bob in significant debt, so much debt, in fact, that he had been in jeopardy of losing his business. But that wasn't even the biggest thing that jumped out at the investigators. They got more information on Bob's life insurance. The policy Diane had told them was worth just $5,000, and they learned that, in fact, Bob had 3 life insurance policies that collectively were worth a total of $400,000, and Diane would get all of it with Bob dead. On June 20th, so almost 2 weeks after the murder, Stephen McCarrick sat across from Diane in an interview room at the St. Charles police station, and they did not waste any time skirting the issue. Steph said they knew Diane had lied to them about her and Bob's financial situation, and perhaps even more importantly, they knew she had also lied about the amount of money she would receive from Bob's life insurance. Diane stayed calm and quiet like she had when the investigators interviewed her the first time. She said she had lied about her and Bob's financial situation for one simple reason: she was embarrassed. This response actually didn't surprise Stephen McCarrick. A lot of people do not feel comfortable talking about money problems, even to police conducting a very serious investigation. But Steph didn't back off. He said Diane's response did not fully explain their issue because it didn't explain why she'd lied about Bob's life insurance. What does that have to do with being embarrassed? But all Diane could say was she didn't realize the payout was as big as it was. Stephen McCarrick did not quite buy it, and so they asked Diane to take a polygraph test. She agreed, and they set up the test that day, and the results came back inconclusive. Now, despite all the reasons the investigators now had to suspect Diane, they had no clear evidence actually tying her to her husband's murder, so they had to let her go. After 2 weeks of their investigation, Stephen McCarrick believed they had several strong leads, but nothing concrete. The rival insurance agent's alibi had checked out. There was still a chance he could have hired someone to kill Bob, but it was an outside chance. On top of that, police had not gotten a hit on the Ford Focus from the surveillance footage, and they hadn't gotten anything from the DNA test conducted on blood samples taken from the crime scene. But finally, as June came to an end, Stephen McCarrick got a hold of Bob's detailed phone records, and those records immediately raised a red flag. Because there was one number that Bob called over and over again, and it wasn't Diane's. It was a Kansas City, Missouri, number belonging to a man that neither investigators had heard of. His name was James Hall. And so Steph contacted James and asked if he knew who Bob-eyed Man was, and James said yes, he knew Bob very well. In fact, the two of them had been lovers. In early July 2007, so almost a month after Bob's murder, Stephen McCarrick made the 3.5-hour drive from St. Charles to Kansas City. Once they were there, they teamed up with some local police and then paid a visit to James at his house. James had known about Bob's murder soon after it happened, so he wasn't surprised the police wanted to talk to him. And James did not try to hide anything. He said that he and Bob had met online and had been having an affair for about 8 months. James even showed the police a bunch of love letters and gifts that Bob had given him. Initially, Stephen McCarrick didn't find anything strange about this, but the more James talked and the more personal items that he showed them, it started to look like he never threw away anything connected to Bob. And the investigators thought this went past the point of romance and into a possible obsession. Finally, McCarrick asked James if anything in their relationship had changed before Bob was killed, and James said yes. There had been a huge change because Bob's wife, Diane, had recently discovered an email exchange between him and Bob, and so she'd learned about the affair. After that, Bob told James he would have to cool things off for a bit with them and focus instead on his marriage to Diane. As Detective Steph and Captain McCarrick made the dock to St. Charles, they began to realize that they now had a full-on love triangle to consider. There was a chance that James had gotten angry when Bob started to back away from their relationship, and maybe he lashed out and killed Bob. But Diane, who already had a clear financial motive, might have also gone into a rage and murdered Bob because he was cheating on her. Both of those theories made sense, but without any real evidence, Steph and McCarrick felt like they were just stumbling around in the dark. By the late summer of 2007, Steph and McCarrick were growing increasingly frustrated with the case. The investigation just kept going the same way it had from the beginning. They had several strong suspects and no concrete evidence. They continued to try to find the Ford Focus along with some clue that might link Diane, James, or anyone else to the crime scene, but nothing turned up on either front. And as the months passed by, new leads stopped coming in. Other investigations demanded the cops focus, and so Bob's case started to go cold. Fast forward to April of 2008, 10 months after Bob's murder. Detective Steph was at his desk when a phone call got transferred to him. He picked up, and he heard the voice of a county forensics officer on the other end, and she sounded excited. As Steph listened to her, a stunned look came across his face, because things like this just didn't usually happen in investigations. The forensic officer explained that the long shot the team had taken by cutting away Bob's back pocket from his pants had paid off because now, almost a year later, the process known as touch DNA sampling had taken a massive leap forward. Essentially, in the past, usable DNA samples could only be obtained from bodily fluids, but now new touch testing methods allowed the lab to obtain DNA samples from skin cells. And so, the lab had tested Bob's back pocket, and they found that whoever had taken Bob's wallet out of that pocket had left their skin cells behind, so they now had a sample of that person's DNA. Detective Steph hung up the phone still in shock. This case that he'd basically given up on suddenly felt like it was about to be solved, and all because a forensic officer had seen what the future might bring and had saved a pants pocket. Steph went to McCarrick's office and told the captain about this huge development, and right away, McCarrick got to work reassembling the investigative team. But even with this new DNA sample, it would still take the investigators some time to put everything together. But eventually, they would sit down face to face with the person who had left their skin cells behind at the crime scene, and at that point, Detective Steph and Captain McCarrick knew who killed Bob Man. Based on the DNA sample evidence found at the crime scene and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Bob Man on June 8, 2007. At 11:00 a.m. that day, the killer and their accomplice sat in a parked Ford Focus in the lot of the strip mall just past Bob's office. They each held a gun and they each had a bandana tied around their neck. At some point, the killer raised their bandana up over their nose to cover their face, and at that point, the accomplice did the same. Then the killer looked over at the accomplice, nodded, and then they both got out of the car and ran up the steps to the second floor of the strip mall. They quickly made it to Bob's office, opened up the door, stepped inside, and shut the door behind them. Bob, who was doing some work at his desk, looked up, but before he could say or do anything, the killer and the accomplice raised their guns, and the killer fired. The bullet grazed Bob on the chin, and he immediately began to scream and put his hand up to the wound. But the killer just moved closer to the desk and fired again, and this shot hit Bob on the neck. Blood poured from his wound as he fell out of his chair and hit the floor. The killer immediately ran around the desk and aimed right at Bob's face and fired the gun again, this time shooting Bob through the eye. Bob would die laying right there on the floor of his office. Once Bob was dead, the killer crouched down and took Bob's wallet out of his back pocket. Then the killer and the accomplice searched the office looking for cash. They knew Bob kept on hand, but they couldn't find anything. And then they heard shouting coming from right below them, and so, in a panic, The killer just grabbed Bob's wallet, put it in his pocket, and then screamed at the accomplice that they needed to run. So the two of them fled the office, slamming the door behind them. They went down the steps, got back in the Ford Focus, and the killer hit the gas and they sped off down the street. And when they got miles away from the strip mall, the killer took Bob's wallet out of their pocket and looked inside of it. The killer took out the cash they saw and handed half of it to their accomplice. Bob-eyed man's murderer was not a jealous wife, an obsessed lover, or a business rival. It turned out the investigators' first theory was right. Bob had been killed by someone who simply wanted to rob him. And that was a man named Paul White. But Paul was not a complete stranger to Bob, because Paul's wife was one of Bob's clients. And months before the murder, Paul had gone with his wife to Bob's office when she made a cash payment for our insurance. So Paul knew Bob must keep cash on hand. On the night before the murder, Paul had lost $1,200 playing blackjack and craps at a casino, and so he was desperate for money. And his solution was he would kill Bob and take all his cash. After staying up all night, Paul got a hold of 2 guns. Then he got his friend, a man named Cleo Hines, to come with him to provide extra muscle. And then the 2 of them went to Bob's office and killed him and then robbed him. However, they didn't find the cash in Bob's desk drawer, and so they ended up committing this cold-blooded murder just for the money they found in Bob's wallet, which was $300 or, after splitting it, $150 each. And they took that money right back to the casino and quickly lost all of it. The investigators had been on the trail of that Ford Focus, which would turn out to belong to Paul's accomplice Cleo, but after almost a year of searching, they still hadn't tracked it down. But when the crime lab conducted their DNA touch testing on the skin cells they pulled from Bob's pocket, those samples eventually lead them to Paul, who happened to be in prison at the time for committing forgery. Investigators were quickly able to connect Paul to his accomplice Cleo and to the Ford Focus they'd seen on the surveillance footage. Bob's wife Diane, who had nothing to do with the crime, would break down in tears during Paul and Cleo's trial. Paul and Cleo were both convicted, and each of them were sentenced to life terms in prison with no possibility of parole. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that reveal we may not be alone in this universe. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Wow Signal, and it's about the very best evidence of potential alien communication we've ever obtained. The second story you'll hear is called Better Than Earth, and it's about the 2020 discovery of 24 superhabitable planets. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Don't Sleep, and it's about one of the most famous potentially paranormal events of all time. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast. Because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please put the Amazon Music follow button stapler in Jello. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Wow Signal. Late one night in the summer of 1977, a large radio telescope in Ohio intercepted a very unique signal. The telescope was searching the sky on behalf of an organization called SETI, which is the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And the signal, although it only lasted 70 seconds, fit the profile of a message beamed to us from another world. Jerry Amon, who was a project scientist for SETI, was flipping through some of the computer printouts generated by the telescope when he noticed a series of letters. Now, the way this particular radio telescope worked is it pretty much constantly picked up a signal, but that signal was a very low background hum of static. And that was represented in 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5. All those low numbers are representative of that basic background sound that they just write off. It doesn't matter. Occasionally, the telescope would pick up a higher number on the readout, like a 7, an 8, a 9, and even above that. It transitions to letters to represent louder radio signals. But all of those higher signals had a rational explanation. Either they were anomalous, or they weren't anomalous, or they were tied to something very natural and ordinary. But that particular night in 1977, As the telescope swept across the sky, it picked up a signal that was so strong it surged past 0 through 9 and made its way into the letters, all the way up to letter U. And it held it for 70 seconds, representing a signal that was 30 times stronger than what this telescope normally picks up as its baseline. And after those 70 seconds, the telescope eventually passed it and that signal dropped all the way back down. So, when Amon saw this amazing string of letters representing this radio signal, he circled it in red ink and wrote next to it, "Wow!" exclamation point. And from that point forward, this transmission became the wow signal, one of the main reasons the wow signal was not immediately cast out as some anomaly or chalked up to some other natural occurrences because of what we understand about radio wave transmission. The goal of this radio telescope was to try to pick up radio signals coming in from other worlds. And so the way they did that is they opened up a whole bunch of different channels, receivers. They had 50 of them. And anytime they were aiming their dish in the direction of the sky, if there was any radio waves coming towards them, they tried to capture them on different radio frequencies. If you were aiming your antenna in a direction where natural radio waves were coming towards you, it would hit one channel and then diffuse over adjacent channels because it's not a targeted radio wave. It's natural. It's more like a shotgun blast. Non-natural radio waves, like the ones we're familiar with when we listen to the radio or listen to music, those are targeted radio waves. Meaning when they were sent out in a very narrow band. They were sent out on a single frequency, and only people that have turned to that particular frequency or that particular receiver are going to hear your message. That is an unnatural radio wave. The night that the wow signal was picked up, it was only picked up on one channel. It did not diffuse over the others. Meaning the wow signal is not natural and was created by someone or something. And for the SETI researchers that are literally combing the sky for signs of extraterrestrial life, this is exactly what they were looking for. It is what an intelligent life form would do to try to communicate. They would use one radio frequency to demonstrate this is intentional. But despite decades of professional and amateur astronomers searching the sky for this wow signal, it's never been found again. While there's many theories about what could have caused a wow signal, obviously ranging from extraterrestrial life, to a comet that passed by in 1977 that we only recently knew about, to a secret spy satellite, the bottom line is, to this day, we cannot adequately explain it. It remains the best evidence of alien communication ever obtained. Our next story is called Better Than Earth. Just 30 years ago, we had not discovered a single planet outside of our solar system. Today, we've discovered over 4,500 of them. And of all those planets we're discovering, 1 in 5 of them scientists now say are most likely habitable. There's really the criteria for a planet to be considered habitable. 1, it needs to be rocky. And 2, it needs to fall into the Goldilocks zone, where it's in its star's orbit in a place where it's neither too hot or too cold, allowing water to be in liquid form. One of the best chances we have so far at finding life on another one of these habitable planets is a planet called Ross 128b. It orbits an inactive red dwarf star, meaning it's likely not being bludgeoned by solar radiation. And we've detected strange signals emanating from a nearby host star, signals that perhaps have intelligent origins. Another habitable planet is Proxima b. It also happens to be the closest habitable planet to Earth and is a lot like Ross 128b. However, the red dwarf it revolves around is much more temperamental and periodically casts out massive amounts of radiation that does make life quite difficult. It's also tidally locked in synchronous rotation with its star, meaning one side of the planet is always facing the star and getting completely torched all the time. The other side, the dark side of the planet, never faces the star, and so everything is frozen. And so, the only place liquid water could exist on Proxima b would be at the equator. Another area of the universe that scientists are focused on to try to see if there's life there right now or could be life is an area called the TRAPPIST-1 system. It's actually 7 different planets, all of which are considered habitable, that are orbiting around this one particular red dwarf. The really cool thing about this particular system is that the 7 planets are super close together, so close that if you were standing on one, you could look up and see all of the others. And you're so close you could actually make out geologic formations like mountains, and you could see clouds. And in theory, you could actually travel between the different planets. So imagine going on vacation to another planet. But to really get you thinking, a new study just released its results in October 2020. They looked at all 4,500 planets that are outside the solar system, and they ranked them according to how likely they are to sustain life, not whether they're currently sustaining life, but looking at their conditions of how good of a planet are they to sustain life. And out of the 4,500, there were 24 at the top of the list that not only can sustain life, but actually can sustain life better than Earth can. They are considered super habitable, and they are literally better places to live than Earth is, which is definitely a foreign concept for most people because they think of Earth as like this oasis in this vast universe where everything lined up perfectly to sustain human life. And already, just out of the 4,500 planets that were reviewed that have only been discovered in the past 30 years, right? There's lots more planets out there. We've already found 24 that are better than Earth at sustaining life. So what happens when we discover there are millions, if not billions of planets out there? Just probability alone says there's going to be a heck of a lot more planets out there that are better at sustaining life than Earth, which really forces you to come to terms with the reality that almost certainly we are not alone. The next and final story of today's episode is called Don't Sleep. Late on the evening of July 27th, 1977, a 21-year-old farmer named Huang Yanchu walked down a wide, dusty road in the little farming village of Bigo, located in northern China. It had been a very hard day on the rice farm where Huang worked because they were all preparing for the autumn harvest. But even though Huang was totally exhausted and worn down as he walked down this road, he was whistling an upbeat tune because for the first time in a long time, Huang was actually excited about the future. Huang had grown up in a poor family, and he hadn't even finished elementary school. He still lived with his parents in a tiny house, and basically every day of his life was the same. He got up at sunrise. He walked to work. He worked all day until he barely could even stand, and then he would walk home and he would go to bed. But the reason Huang was now feeling kind of excited about his future was because he had just gotten engaged to a beautiful girl in a neighboring village, and their plan was to get married after the autumn harvest. Huang was already hard at work literally building them a house that they could move into after they got married. And in fact, on this particular night, that was where Huang was going. He was going to the property where he was in the middle of building this house. And he was going there not to work on the house anymore, but really just to admire his property because, again, he was just so excited about the future. Huang turned the corner and his beautiful, half-constructed home came into focus. The foundation, the walls, and the ceiling were all complete. All he had left to do was put in the windows and the doors. And so Huang walked up and ran his hand over the beautiful brick he'd laid around the outside of the property. Brick was not cheap. He had worked extra hours to afford this brick, and so he was just so proud of it, and he ran his hand over it. And then he kind of stepped back and kind of imagined the house when it was all done. And then when he felt satisfied that he had seen enough, he just kind of nodded and turned and just continued walking back towards his home, his parents' home, which was only a few minutes away. When Huang got to his home, he went inside and his mom already had a meal made for him. It was just some rice and veggies. And so Huang sat down and began eating, and then his parents came over and they began chatting. And then, of course, the conversation shifted to Huang's upcoming marriage because that's basically all Huang ever wanted to talk about. And then, by about 10 RGM, Huang was so tired that he crawled into his bed and he fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, when Huang's parents woke up, they discovered that Huang was not in his bed. Now, this was not totally unusual because they knew their son was a really hard worker, and it wasn't unusual for him to wake up really early to head out to the farm to begin his work day. But a little while later, the workers at the rice farm where Huang worked, they saw Huang had not come to work, and because that was so out of character for him, one of the workers actually walked to Huang's parents' home to see if he was okay. And when Huang's mother found out her son had not shown up to work, she was really worried. But she told this worker, "Oh, my son must have gone to the house he's building. Go over there and see if he's there." But the worker from the rice farm went to Huang's property he was building and nobody was there. And so when he came back and told Huang's mother this, it sent her into a total panic because really, for her, this was like completely out of character for her son. He would never miss work. He would never just disappear like this. Something was wrong. So Huang's mother sent this rice farm worker to go find her husband and tell him what was going on with Huang. And then in the meantime, Huang's mother just walked outside and began going door to door, asking neighbors if they knew where her son was and if they wouldn't mind coming out and helping her look. Now, at this time, the village of Bigo was a relatively small place where all the residents more or less knew each other. And so it did not take long for the news of Huang being missing to spread all across Bigo, and the community really came out in force to go look for him. And so by the afternoon, you had villagers all over the place, literally biking all around town, calling out for Huang. People had gone to neighboring villages to see if he was there. Some other people went to Huang's fiance's home and spoke directly to the fiance. But she had no idea where Huang had gone. And so by about the early afternoon, when so many people couldn't find any leads to where Huang had gone, it became clear that really nobody had a clue what happened to him. Now, Bigo at the time was incredibly isolated. This is a small town where most of the people who live there don't have phones, they don't have cars, they ride their bikes everywhere, and there were no roads that connected Bigo to any other place. Now, there was a paved road that went through Bigo, but it actually just came to an end on the outskirts of Bigo, so there was just no way to go to other places, at least not efficiently. Basically, if you lived in Bigo at the time, there was a finite number of places you could go, and all these people that had gone out looking for Huang had searched all of those places, and Huang just was not there. And they discovered his bike was still leaning up against his parents' house, and his work clothes, which he wore basically every single day, were still folded up neatly inside of his room. And so wherever Huang was, he was on foot and he was still in his pajamas. That night, Huang's parents would contact the village committee, which was basically like the governing body for Bigo. And the village committee decided that this was serious enough because, again, they're thinking this is impossible, where is this guy? That they decided to contact the police. But when the police got this call, they did not launch an investigation right away because they had limited resources and there was no sign of foul play. Here was no sign of foul play. It was very weird that Huang was missing, but he was an adult, and if he wanted to go vanish somewhere, it was kind of like, okay, you're an adult. You can do that. And so Huang's family and the rest of the Bigo villagers were forced to just kind of wait and see if Huang came back. But over the next few days, Huang did not come back, and there was still no new information about what might have happened to him. Early on the morning of August 5th, so 8 days after Huang went missing, and still by this point there's no sign of him, the deputy director of the Agao village committee came running up the road to Huang's parents' house and knocked on the door. When the door opened up, it was Huang's father, and the deputy director handed him a telegram he had just gotten and said, "Read it." And so Huang's father took the telegram and began reading it. And as he did, his eyes went wide, and then when he was done, he looked up and he was just so confused. The telegram had been sent 8 days earlier at around 9:00 a.m. on July 28th. So basically, right around the time that Huang's family discovered Huang was missing was when this telegram was sent. But for whatever reason, the telegram had been very delayed, and so they were just receiving this telegram now, 8 days later. And the contents of this telegram made no sense. It said that just 9 hours after Huang had fallen asleep in his parents' home, he was discovered lying on the sidewalk in the middle of this bustling city called Nanjing, located 600 miles to the north of Bigo. Now the reason Huang's father and the deputy director were so confused by this telegram was, this was impossible. Remember, Huang does not have a car, so the only way he could get around was on foot or on his bike. And we know he left his bike by his house, so he's on foot and very likely in his pajamas. And what? He's gonna go 600 miles to the north. I mean, even if he walked the 30 miles to the nearest train station, 9 hours, cause that's how much time it took from falling asleep to being discovered in the city, is not enough time to go the remaining 570 miles to Nanjing. So Huang's father and the deputy director, they talked about this, and they both decided that, this just can't be true. Clearly, somebody has mistaken some other person for Huang, because he cannot possibly be all the way in Nanjing. Now, this telegram said that Huang was being held in a deportation center in Shanghai. And so Huang's father and the deputy director decided they would send the telegram back to the sender at this deportation center and tell them, hey, if this really is Huang, he should have a very specific birthmark on his wrist. And so when they sent this telegram off, they fully expected to get one back that said, oops, our mistake, it wasn't him. But they got a reply relatively quickly and it said, oh, yeah, he's got that exact birthmark. It's definitely Huang, but he's very confused. He doesn't really know what's going on, and so somebody from your village has to go get him. Huang arrived back home in the middle of August, so about 2 weeks after he had gone missing. And as soon as he got there, his fiancée and his parents were so happy to see him, and pretty soon a steady stream of friends and neighbors and other family members began coming to Huang's house to talk to him, to hear his story, to hear about what happened. I mean, this is a tiny, isolated place in the middle of rural China. Not a lot of exciting things happen out here, and so people were really excited to hear what Huang had to say. But Huang really didn't understand what had happened to him. And so mostly he just didn't answer any questions he got asked. He just kind of kept his head down and just kept saying, I don't know. I don't know what happened. And then really, when his family pressed him and said, you gotta tell us, this is so crazy what happened, he would say, look, I'm gonna tell you what happened, but I don't even know if I can believe the things I'm gonna tell you. And so Huang would say, all he could remember was he went to bed in his own bed in Biaigao. And then the next morning he woke up and he was laying on the sidewalk. And when he opened his eyes, he saw there was this big swimming pool, and then near it was a sign that said Nanjing. And so that was how he put together that he was in Nanjing. And then almost immediately, these two police officers wearing all white just kind of appeared out of nowhere. And they walked up to Huang, they scooped him up, and without really saying anything to him, they brought him to that deportation center in Shanghai, which is a place where people who seem confused or mentally ill would be sent in order to help them get home. And that was it. That was Huang's entire story, that he just basically woke up in Nanjing with no idea how he got there. And so after he told his family, they all just kind of looked at him like, really? That's what happened. That makes no sense. But Huang, he was completely lucid. He was explaining it really specifically and really simply. He looked and sounded exactly like he normally did, and he seemed very honest as he was telling the story. Over the next few weeks, Huang kind of reintegrated back into his life, but things just were not the same. People were now scared of him. Kids literally ran away from him when they saw him because rumors were going around town that he himself, his body was haunted or something. And so kids were scared of him, and other villagers would openly gossip about him right in front of him. Even his beloved fiancée admitted to feeling really uncomfortable around him now. And while all of this was obviously very upsetting for Huang, he did also understand why people were acting this way. This is a very anomalous thing that's happened to him, and he did not have a good explanation for this totally insane event that he was a part of. And so he just kind of got it. And in fact, Huang himself was kind of terrified of himself. At night when he would go to bed, he would be terrified that the second he closed his eyes, he was going to be transported hundreds or thousands of miles away to some totally unknown place. And maybe this time, he wouldn't even be able to get back again. But as the days wore on, Huang continued to wake up in his own bed in Biaigao, which over time kind of made him feel more secure that whatever happened to him was a one-time thing and it's not going to happen again. However, Huang would be wrong. On September 8th, 1977, so 3 weeks after Huang had returned back home, he went to sleep in his bed in the village of Biaigao. But when he woke up the next morning, he was not there. The first thing Huang noticed when he woke up that morning were the sounds around him were totally different. They were not right. Normally, when he was asleep in his home, he would hear the sound of his mother and father snoring right by him, and he might hear some insects or birds out his window. And those sounds were gone. Instead, he heard what sounded like footsteps, but not ordinary footsteps. They were footsteps of somebody walking on cement who was wearing high heels, like a clicking sound. And then Huang also became aware of the fact that his face was clearly pressed up against cement. He was laying on the ground, but Huang couldn't open his eyes. As hard as he tried, he couldn't do it. He couldn't move his body. And so, he's just laying there on cement with his eyes closed, listening to the sound of these footsteps, these high heels getting closer and closer and closer and closer and closer and closer. And as they did, his anxiety was growing and growing. He had no idea who this person was. And then these footsteps, they got right up to him and then passed by him. And Huang felt the breeze as this person walked right past him. And then after this person in high heels had kind of walked off in the other direction, Huang finally was able to wrench open his eyes, and he sat up and he looked around. And what? He couldn't find anybody. It was totally abandoned all around him, so whoever had those high heels on had somehow vanished in plain sight. And then also, as Huang continued to look around him, it looked like he was in the middle of the city. But again, there's nobody out there. Oh, it's like this abandoned city street. All he had in front of him was this clock up on a building that said what? 0 And so pretty soon, Huang was just kind of walking in circles, screaming out for help. And right when he was about to just start sprinting in any one direction in hope that help would be somewhere out there, Huang felt a tap on his shoulder. And then the person tapping him from behind him said, "Are you Huang Yanchu?" Huang spun around and he saw there were these two men in military uniforms standing there. And for a second, Huang felt relieved. Somebody was here to help him. But then he thought to himself, how do they know my name? What's going on here? And so he asked them, how do you know my name? But the two men didn't answer Huang. Instead, they told him that he was at a Shanghai railway station, 700 miles from Biagao, and that these two soldiers, were here to take Huang to a nearby army base. At this point, Huang was so scared he just didn't know what to do, so he just wound up going with these two soldiers, who put him in the back of a jeep. And then they hopped in and began driving. And they drove him out of this weird, abandoned city where he had woken up. And after driving for some time, they arrived at this huge army base that had all these rows of fencing around it with razor wire on top and all these sentries that guarded all the doors. And these two soldiers brought him through several of these checkpoints, and then when they reached the very last one, they stopped the car. They got out. Huang got out too, and the two soldiers that were with him grabbed Huang's shoulders and they basically lead him through the last checkpoint, which was manned by armed guards. And as Huang was led through this gate, the armed guards seemed to not even notice the soldiers or Huang. It was like they were invisible to the armed guards. But either way, they got through the final checkpoint. And then the two soldiers that were carrying Huang led him to this kind of nondescript big building, and they opened up a door and they began walking down this long hallway that kind of zigged and zagged. It was like a maze of different directions you could go. And then finally, they brought Huang right to this big door that said division headquarters over it. And then before Huang could say anything, one of the two soldiers that was with him knocked on the door, and then before anybody could respond, that same soldier reached down, opened it up, swung the door in, and then they pushed Huang inside. And they stepped in after him and shut the door behind them. In front of Huang was this big desk, and sitting behind this desk was a very senior-looking military official wearing a uniform. And this official, when they looked up and saw Huang standing there, they got up to their feet and put their hands on their gun and said, "What are you doing here? How did you get in here?" And Huang, sensing there was something wrong, threw his hands up to show he was not a threat and pointed behind him and said, "They brought me here, robbed me." And the military official, who still had his hand on his gun, looked behind Huang and said, "Who brought you here, earrings?" And Huang, he turned around and he saw the two soldiers who had picked him up and driven him here and lead him to this room. They were gone. Which was impossible because Huang would have heard them leave. He didn't hear anything. The door never opened. They just somehow were gone. A second later, the senior military official had pulled out his radio and he was screaming commands. And then another second later, armed soldiers came running into the room. They grabbed Huang, who still had his hands up. They came in, they arrested Huang, and they began asking him all these questions about how he got in here. How did you get through the guards? Did you climb the fence? Did you cut the fence? How did you get in here? It's not possible that you are here right now. But Huang did not have any answers. All he could say was that 2 soldiers they brought me here was. A couple of days later, Huang would be bussed back to Biaigao. And again, his friends and family and everybody in town had all these questions about what happened. But again, Huang just had no answers. And then, just 11 days after coming back home the second time, Huang would disappear again. And this time, he would tell people he encountered 2 men who told him they were the same 2 men from the other 2 times he had gone missing. You had the first instance where he woke up and the police officers in white picked him up off the ground and brought him to the deportation center. And then the second time was the military base where you had those 2 soldiers who brought him through the gates and brought him to division headquarters. Basically, these 2 men he encountered on the third trip were saying they were the same men across all 3 instances. And on this third instance that he went missing, Huang said these 2 men put him on their backs and they flew him to 9 different cities around China for reasons unknown. And then they flew him back to Biaigao and just dropped him off right outside his house near a tree, and that was a T. Now, of course, this final disappearance sounds the most absurd because, what? He was flying on the backs of people to all these different cities. That doesn't make any sense. But when Huang was kind of aggressively questioned about this third story, cause it sounded the most made up as compared to the other 2, it would turn out Huang had all this kind of insider information about each of the 9 cities that he supposedly was flown to by these 2 men. He knew the weather in each of those cities on the night that he was gone. He knew what shows were playing on the night he was gone. And he also just had really specific descriptions of where he was in each of these cities when they got there that all checked out. Now you gotta remember that getting that information correct would have been really hard for Huang. At the time, he did not have internet access, he didn't have a phone, he didn't have a car. I mean, he lives in an isolated small village in rural China. So, the idea that literally the morning after all this happens, he's flown to these different cities, that he would have all this information perfectly correct, that's hard to do. That would be hard to lie about. As of today, no one has ever been able to debunk Huang's stories. Basically, there's enough legitimacy and verifiable information in his stories that you really can't discount them. They really could have happened. Add in the fact that Huang actually took a lie detector test and passed it, and suddenly you're looking at a story that, as crazy as it sounds, really could have happened. And so Huang's story today is considered far and away the most famous UFO story in China's history, because the leading theory here is that Huang must have been abducted by aliens, and that's how he was being moved around to all these places. And maybe those 2 men that kept showing up in each of these events were the extraterrestrials that had scooped him up. Nobody knows, but that is the theory. As for Huang, he wishes none of this had ever happened, because his disappearances and whatever happened to him basically wrecked his life. His fiancée broke up with him because she was so uncomfortable around him, and there was a lot of stigma around Huang, especially in the village, where everybody thought he was a liar. And then on top of that, all these news and film and TV crews came to the village because they wanted to shoot shows and documentaries about Huang. And Huang did not want anything to do with them. But again, all these people are coming to the village for Huang, and it's making the rest of the villagers upset. And then also, there was a really lengthy investigation by the police and by the military to try to figure out how in the world Huang got into that army base. I mean, there were layers and layers of security that he somehow got through. And all those armed guards that were watching the gate said they never saw Huang walk through, even though Huang said he literally just walked through the gate with the 2 soldiers that were carrying him through. And so today, Huang actually still lives in Biaigao, and he had a son and a daughter and he has grandkids. But he refuses to talk about what happened to him because, again, it wrecked his life. A quick note about our stories, they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.